On the first day of January 1945, in desert country less than 30 miles from the Mexican border, a Tohono O'odham man found two strangers asleep on the ground. They were German prisoners of war, and they had been out of their camp in Arizona for 9 days. 9 days out, 30 miles short, asleep in the open. That is how the largest enemy escape in American history ended for two of the men who made it. Here is what the United States Army did to them. It put them on bread and water. 1 day of it for every day they had been gone. 9 months earlier, on the other side of the world, 76 men had come out of a tunnel very much like the one those two had crawled through. 50 of those men were shot. Same act, same war, same treaty signed by both countries, sitting in both filing cabinets, saying the same thing in the same language. Two completely different answers. The two men in the desert did not know any of that yet. What some of the escapers had expected, from the night they went into the tunnel, was that being caught meant being shot. Their own army had set that standard. When they planned this escape, they planned it expecting the worst, because they knew exactly what happened to prisoners who ran. If you have been here a while, you already know how 25 German prisoners dug their way out of Arizona. The question this video is after is why the two numbers came out different, 50 and 0. The answer is an uncomfortable one, at least at first. What kept those two men alive in the desert was arithmetic, a document, and the fact that the two countries were not holding the same number of each other's men. Start with the document, because everything else in this story gets measured against it. In July of 1929 in Geneva, most of the military powers of the world signed a convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. It runs to 97 articles. Most of them are dull in the way that useful things are dull. Rations, mail, pay, religious services, the right to keep your own boots. Two of those articles are the reason this story exists. Article 50 says that a prisoner of war who escapes and is recaptured before he can rejoin his own army shall be liable only to disciplinary punishment. Only. Not a trial, not a criminal charge. Discipline, the way a barracks handles a man who missed a parade. Article 54 sets the ceiling on that discipline. Imprisonment is the most severe disciplinary punishment which may be inflicted on a prisoner of war, and the duration of any single punishment shall not exceed 30 days. That word, disciplinary, is doing real work. A prisoner could still be tried for an actual crime. Digging was not one. 30 days. That is the whole penalty. That is what the world agreed, in writing, that a country was permitted to do to a man who tunneled out of its camp and got caught. And the convention goes further than permission. It treats escape as something a prisoner is more or less expected to attempt. An officer trying to get home was doing his job. The men guarding him were doing theirs. Nobody in 1929 pretended otherwise. The convention was written by people who had watched the camps of the last war at close range. Enforcement was inspection, and that was all of it. Switzerland acted as the protecting power for both sides, and delegates of the International Committee of the Red Cross walked through the compounds, counted the men, tasted the food, and wrote reports that went to the other government. Somebody neutral looks, and then somebody on the far side of the war reads about it. Germany signed the convention and ratified it. The United States signed it and ratified it. Both of them built their prisoner of war systems on top of it. 30 days. That number comes back twice, and it means something completely different both times. Now, the tunnel in Arizona. Camp Papago Park sat on the eastern edge of Phoenix, in low desert, among red sandstone buttes. It opened as a camp for Italian prisoners, and in January of 1944 it was converted to hold Germans, most of them Kriegsmarine. submariners and surface crews, men pulled out of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean and shipped halfway around the world to a place with almost no water in it. The American command then made a decision that looks reasonable until you look at it twice. The prisoners with a record of escaping, the ones who would not settle, were concentrated together. They were put into Section 1A of Compound 1. Every man in that compound had already proved he would try. So they tried. The tunnel started under a bathhouse. It ran 178 feet, out under the wire, toward the cross-cut canal. Spoil is always the problem with a tunnel because dirt that comes out of the ground has to go somewhere a guard will not look. The prisoners solved that by asking permission to build a sports field. They wanted to play Faustball, a German game a little like volleyball. The Americans said yes. A field needs leveling, and leveling a field means moving dirt. They finished digging on the 20th of December. On the night of the 23rd, starting around 9 in the evening and running until 2:30 in the morning, 25 men went through it, 12 officers and 13 enlisted men. It remains the largest escape of Axis prisoners from any American facility in the war. That is the part you may have heard. You can check the spine of this video yourself. Article 50 of the 1929 Geneva Convention is 2 sentences long. Look it up and time yourself. Under a minute, and you will have read the exact text that 50 men were killed in violation of, and that 25 men in Arizona were saved by. It is worth the minute, because the rest of this only lands if you accept that both governments knew what that sentence said. They did. It was not obscure. It was the working law of every camp on both sides. And if you want the next one of these to find you when it is finished, that is what the subscribe button is for. It costs nothing, and it is the only thing that decides whether any of this reaches anybody at all. 25 men walking into the Sonoran Desert in December sounds like a story about desperation. Look at who was in that tunnel. The senior German officer at Papago Park was Kapitän zur See Jürgen Wattenberg, and he had been in this war since its first month. He was the navigator of the Admiral Graf Spee. In December of 1939, off the coast of Uruguay, the Graf Spee fought 3 British cruisers in the first major surface action of the war, took damage, ran for Montevideo, and was scuttled by her own captain in the mouth of the River Plate. Wattenberg went into internment in Argentina. He got himself out, made it back to Germany, and took command of a submarine. That submarine was U-162, and in September of 1942, northeast of Trinidad, 3 British destroyers caught her and sank her. Wattenberg survived the sinking. The war then moved him to Arizona. In the same compound was Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Guggenberger. In November of 1941, commanding U-81 in the Mediterranean, Guggenberger hit HMS Ark Royal amidships with a single torpedo. One of the most famous aircraft carriers in the Royal Navy went down the following day under tow. He was given the Knight's Cross for it, and the Oak Leaves just over a year later. He survived the war, joined the West German Navy, and retired as a rear admiral. These were not stragglers. This was the officer class of the Kriegsmarine, decorated, experienced, and loose in the American Southwest. And now the date, because the date is the entire point. The 23rd of December, 1944. That week, 5,500 miles east, the American Army was having the worst days it would have in Europe. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes had opened on the 16th. By the 23rd, Bastogne was surrounded. American divisions had been overrun and broken apart in the fog, and thousands of American soldiers were being marched east into German captivity. That last detail comes back. So consider the desk that the report landed on. You are an American officer. It is Christmas week. Your army is being hit harder than it has been hit at any point in the war. And a telephone call tells you that 25 enemy naval prisoners, including a man who fought at the River Plate and a man who sank the Ark Royal, have just walked out from under your fence in Arizona and are somewhere in the desert. If a country was ever going to make an example of somebody, that was the week for it. Nobody would have needed it explained to them. The paperwork would have been easy to write. Nothing of the kind happened. A large manhunt followed. But nothing in the way those men were treated changed, because the way they were treated came out of the same document the two in the desert would eventually be judged by. Now go back 9 months and about 6,000 miles. Stalag Luft III sat near the town of Sagan, in what was then eastern Germany and is now western Poland. It held Allied Air Force officers, and the Luftwaffe ran it. That matters more than it sounds. The camp was not an SS operation. It was run by airmen, and it was run, on the whole, by the book, because the Luftwaffe had a professional interest in how its own downed pilots were being treated on the other side of the war. Its commandant was Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindeine Wildau. By the accounts of the prisoners themselves, he was a decent man in an impossible job, and he had warned them plainly that escaping had become dangerous in a way it had not been earlier in the war. They dug anyway, and the scale of what they built is difficult to take in. 3 tunnels, named Tom, Dick, and Harry, sunk 30 feet down to get beneath the microphones the Germans had buried along the wire. 600 prisoners worked on them in some capacity. There was a forgery department producing travel papers, a tailoring department turning uniforms into civilian suits, and a manufacturing operation that made an air pump out of kit bags and a railway out of bedboards. Harry ran more than 300 feet. On the night of the 24th of March, 1944, 76 men went through it before the 77th was spotted coming out of the exit, which had fallen short of the tree line. The plan had been for 200 men. What stopped it was the ordinary friction of a tunnel in March. The exit came up short of the trees, which meant every man had to be walked out singly, on a signal from somebody lying in the woods. There was snow on the ground, and the night was bitterly cold. An air raid put the camp lights out, which sounds like luck until you remember that the tunnel was lit off the same circuit. They got 76 men out over about 6 hours, not the 200 they had planned for, and men were still coming up when a guard walking the wire before dawn saw one of them rise out of the ground. 76 out. 3 reached safety, 2 Norwegians and a Dutchman. The rest, 73 men, were back in German hands within about 2 weeks. Under Article 50, every one of those 73 men had committed an offense whose maximum penalty was 30 days. 50 of them were shot. The order came from the top, and the paper trail of how it was assembled is one of the reasons anybody was ever convicted for it. Hitler was told about the escape the next day and wanted every recaptured officer shot, all 73 of them. Goering, who ran the Luftwaffe, argued against it, and Keitel and others were in the room. And here is the thing about that argument. The case that got through to Hitler was an accounting case. Germany was holding Allied airmen, the Allies were holding German airmen, and shooting 73 prisoners would invite exactly the same treatment in return. Hitler gave ground and set a proportion instead, more than half. Himmler took that proportion and turned it into a number, 50. From there it went to Arthur Neeb, head of the Reich Criminal Police, who almost certainly chose which 50. The men were collected from the prisons and police cells they had been taken to, driven out in 2s and 3s, told they were being transferred, and shot at the roadside. Their bodies were cremated. The ashes were sent back to Stalag Luft III in urns, and the prisoners were given permission to build a memorial for them at the cemetery outside the camp. The new commandant approved it and contributed to it himself. The same state that ordered the killings shipped the ashes back to the dead men's friends and then let those friends build a monument over them. There was an official report, and the report said the men had been shot while resisting arrest or attempting further escape. 50 men killed, not one wounded. Nobody believed it in 1944 either. So why did the argument in that room turn on reprisals rather than on right and wrong? Because reprisal is what the convention actually ran on, not conscience, bookkeeping. The treaty ran on symmetry. No court could reach into a camp in Silesia or a camp in Arizona and enforce a single line of it. Every country holding prisoners was also a country whose own men were being held somewhere else. Treat them badly, and the bill arrives, delivered to your own sons in somebody else's compound. That is why Göring made the argument he made, and it is why the argument very nearly worked. If you have seen the video on the German prisoners in the American camps, you have heard one half of this before. America ran those camps by the book, and not out of tenderness. Here is the half that video never reached. What the same arithmetic looked like from the German end of it, and what happened when a government stopped doing the sum. Put the numbers up. At its peak, in May of 1945, the United States held more than 425,000 Axis prisoners on its own soil. 371,000 of them were German. They were spread through hundreds of camps across most of the states of the Union, picking cotton, cutting timber, canning vegetables, because America had sent its own farm labor overseas and needed the hands. Across the whole war, Germany held 92,965 American prisoners. Those are two different kinds of measurement, a snapshot set against a running total, so do not take 4-to-1 as a clean figure. Take the shape of it. The shape is this. America was holding the bigger crowd, and that gave America the bigger stick. Germany had the bigger number of its own people sitting behind American fences, and that gave Germany the bigger thing to lose. Every American in German hands was a deposit against American conduct in Arizona and Texas and Oklahoma. Every one of those 371,000 Germans was a deposit against German conduct at Sagan. The War Department understood its half of that completely and said so plainly. Humane treatment of enemy prisoners was policy because it was expected to purchase humane treatment for Americans, and it ran in both directions, with everybody involved aware of it. Red Cross delegates wrote reports on the camps in Arizona, and those reports were read in Berlin. Delegates wrote reports on the camps in Silesia, and those were read in Washington. German prisoners in American camps wrote letters home, and German censors read them. The file was open at both ends, permanently, and both governments were aware of who was looking, which is exactly why what happened at Sagan had to be dressed up as something else. Nobody in Berlin sent a note to Switzerland saying that 50 officers had been executed for digging a hole. They filed a report claiming the men were shot resisting arrest, because they understood perfectly well that the truth would not survive being read on the other side. The two men found asleep in the desert on New Year's Day owed their lives to a system built to make cruelty expensive. Which raises the harder question, and it is a sharper question now than it was a minute ago. Germany had more of its own people at risk than America did. Germany broke the rule anyway. The documents do not answer why. What follows is my reading of it. A country that expects to win a war wants its prisoners back afterward. A country that has begun to understand it is going to lose is running a different calculation. Reprisal only frightens you while you still believe there is going to be a settlement, with tables and lists, and men coming home. In March of 1944, the Luftwaffe still believed that, and that is why Göring objected. The men above the Luftwaffe had stopped. The threat had lost its grip at the top of the German state a full year before the state itself came apart. Two things need saying here. The first is that Papago Park was not well run. A 178-foot tunnel does not get dug under a competently supervised compound. The guards missed the digging. They missed the spoil. They missed a sports field being graded out of tunnel dirt, and they missed a boat being built in pieces inside a prisoner of war camp. Putting all the known escape risks into one compound made them convenient to watch, and it also gave them each other. The camp answered for that afterward, as it should have. The second is that arithmetic only explains part of it. Reciprocity told the United States to stay inside the law. Staying inside the law still leaves a country a wide range of ways to behave, and America took the quiet end of it. The recaptured men were separated from the rest of the camp, put on restricted rations for as many days as they had been absent, and then returned to being prisoners. There were no transfers to a punishment camp, and the policy did not change. They were all back inside the wire within 6 weeks. 2 were found asleep in the desert on New Year's Day. Guggenberger and Quayet Fazlum were picked up within 10 miles of the Mexican border. 3 more were caught near Gila Bend on the 8th of January, having found that the watercourse they had planned to float down had almost no water in it. Wattenberg was the last. He stayed out 36 days, most of them in a cave in the hills north of the city, supplied by other prisoners who were being taken out on work details. He was arrested in Phoenix on the 28th of January, 1945. 36 days at large by the senior German officer in the camp during the Battle of the Bulge. He was returned to the compound and put on bread and water. The convention capped any single punishment at 30 days, and he had been gone 36, so the arithmetic ran out somewhere. Most likely they simply stopped at the ceiling. No record I could find says 25 men recaptured, none killed, none wounded. The report from Sagan had claimed the second of those figures too, 50 killed, none wounded. In Arizona, the pair of them happened to be true. The 30 days in Article 50 had one more piece of work to do. In the autumn of 1945, the Royal Air Force opened an investigation into the 50. It was run by the RAF's own Special Investigation Branch under Wing Commander Wilfred Bowes and Squadron Leader Frank McKenna, and it stands as the only major war crime of that war investigated from beginning to end by a single service branch of a single country. McKenna had been a police officer in Blackpool before the war. He went into occupied Germany with a list of names and started finding them. He had very little to work with. The Gestapo had destroyed what it could. The men who had fired the shots had scattered into a country holding millions of displaced people, and Germany itself was now cut into occupation zones with borders the investigators had to negotiate every time a lead crossed one. What they did have was the urns. Each one had been labeled with the name of the place where the body was cremated, and those place names gave the investigation its first map. 2 years of that work produced the men who stood in the dock at Hamburg. On the 1st of July, 1947, 18 men went on trial at the Curio House in Hamburg. The trial ran 50 days. On the 3rd of September, the verdicts came down. 14 of the accused were sentenced to death. 13 of them were hanged at Hameln Prison in February of 1948, and the 14th had his sentence commuted. Others received long prison terms, and a second trial followed the year after that. And the legal ground the entire proceeding stood on was the sentence we started with. Escape had always been a disciplinary offense with a ceiling of 30 days, written into a treaty that Germany had signed, ratified, and built its own camp system around, and every man in that courtroom could read it. That put the killings outside any argument about acts of war. They were the murder of unarmed prisoners, and murder is a thing a court can try. 13 men were hanged at Hameln because of 2 sentences written in 1929 to keep prisoners alive. Nobody drafting them in Geneva imagined the clause working in that direction. 2 tunnels, 9 months apart. One of them ends in 50 urns delivered back to the camp the men had escaped from. And then, 4 years later, in 13 hangings at Hameln, ordered by a British military court after an investigation run by the Air Force whose men had been killed. The other ends in a ration change and a stack of paperwork. The camp tightened up. The men went back to work. And then they waited. The American camps did not finish emptying until the summer of 1946, and a great many of those prisoners were handed on to Britain and France for labor before they saw Germany again. Guggenberger did not get home until August of 1946. There is some American decency in the Arizona side of this, and it would be easy to stop there. The record shows something colder and more useful. A country that could afford to shrug at the largest enemy escape in its history in the same weeks as the costliest battle the United States Army has ever fought, and that never once needed to make an example of anybody in order to feel secure. Here is what that pair of ledgers suggests. The severity of a punishment measures fear rather than strength. Harsh punishment looks like what a government reaches for once it has stopped believing it will get its own people back. The Reich shot 50 airmen in the spring of 1944, and the best reading of why is that by then it was afraid. It was right to be afraid. The United States gave 25 men bread and water because it was not. One question to close on. Almost everybody has heard of the Great Escape. Hardly anybody has heard of the one in Arizona, and the 2 of them are the same event with the ending swapped. So, I would like to know this from you. What other rule of that war have you come across where both sides signed the same page and only one of them kept it? Put it below. Name the rule and the year if you can.